What's up, everybody? I'm Lucas here with Paul Cohen Engineering. Today we're talking all things clamper. I'm going to take one of these clampers, I'm going to totally disassemble it, and then I'm going to reassemble it. Along that line, I'm going to be pointing out some tips and tricks if you're taking certain parts off, some things to really look out for to keep your threads in top-notch condition. We're going to have some fun. We might make fun of Patrick a little bit, and I hope that it's really useful if you do any kind of clamper maintenance, so that we avoid you having to send your clamper back into me so that I can fix something that you messed up and then you're off your bike, and then it's just not that fun. So we're gonna take this apart, we'll put it back together, and I hope you guys find it useful. Thanks. Okay, welcome back, Earthlings. So we're going to do a full disassembly of this clamper, and then I'll point out a few things about the inside, and then we'll put it back together. This guide works for any clamper you buy from us, whether it's IS like this one, or if it's a flat mount version. And then regardless of the pull, short pull, long pull, or campy pull, this guide is all the same. For this assembly, you're definitely going to need a 2.5 mil, a 3 mil, you can even have a T25 on hand, and then I like to have a little flathead screwdriver in case you need to pry a washer off. So step one is going to be to remove the actuator arm. The actuator arm is held on by this little button head screw on the top. So if you take that 3 mil and pop this off, this is the threads have some blue Loctite on there, so it might take a little bit to get that screw cracked off. Once you remove that screw, your actuator arm should come off. There is this little penny washer on top, so be mindful of that. So actuator arm put on by this penny screw and this button head. Set these guys aside. All right, the next thing of note is very important. Both of these adjusters are being held in place partially by these detent kits. These detent kits, it's a ball bearing, it's a spring, and then this set screw that we can see on top. If you're going to do any kind of major adjustment to either of these pieces, you should back these out, usually completely, and I would just take the whole thing out and set the little parts aside. The ball bearing is being applied, there's a lot of force being applied to that ball bearing against the threads of this adjuster, and if that's dialed in too tightly, and then you really start wrenching the adjusters, you're going to start to mess the threads up. So step two, I guess, is going to be to remove those detent kits. So I'll start back here. 2.5 Allen. We'll take this little set screw out. It's very small, so I'd have a little dish or a rag set aside, some safe place to put these pieces, because if that ball bearing goes bouncing around your shop, you're probably not going to find it again. So I took the set screw out, and then a spring and a ball bearing will follow. This kit, we call it a detent kit. It's to help better index these two adjusters to dial in your pads around your rotor. We sell these as a kit on the website. If you have a clamper from a few years ago, we had a ball plunger set in there, but that's the exact issue we're running into, where people were using the ball plunger, so it was one unit, they're using it as a set screw, and they were fixing these adjusters in place, and then forgetting, and then going to adjust it, and just grinding the hell out of the threads, and it was kind of ruining everything. So two of these, this and then the identical one on the front. So we'll set these aside, like so. And then we'll take this adjuster off since we're back here. This is just going to thread off really nicely. This is going to be a good time to take a rag and kind of clean out. This is a brand new clamper, so we're not seeing that, but you'll see some dust or dirt and some kind of buildup there, so you can really clean those threads out. And then we'll do the same to the adjuster. Just kind of give it a once over, clean those threads out. Maybe some alcohol would help if you've been riding some real dirty trails and got this thing dirty. All right, set this aside for now. That's really all that's going back here. This would be the inboard side of a clamper. This is your pad retention screw. We're not really going to touch that now, but I guess when you do your disassembly, you'd have this out if you wanted to take the pads out. And then these two screws. These are our backing plate retaining screws. So there's two of these. They're patched with Loctite, and they're just affixing this piece we call the backing plate onto the caliper body. There's really never a reason Unless you're replacing this part because it got damaged, there's never a reason where you should be taking those two out. It's kind of crucial to the clamper functioning for those to stay on and stay tight. So my recommendation is to never touch those. They're torqued on there pretty high, and there is that, again, that patch. So those should stay pretty solid for you. All right, onto the front side. There's a lot more happening on this side. So we're going to remove this D10 kit, and then we're going to take this adjuster off, and after that, we'll pull out the entire piston assembly. But first, we have this cutaway, so it's another clamper. This is a flat mount, and we have the side cut out so you can kind of see what's going on inside this clamper here. If you've been to any of the trade shows that we go to or to any of the events we run aid stations at, you've probably seen one of these. It's a really great way to show people what's going on inside your clamper as you're using it. On this side, there's a cutaway that shows that detent kit and how the ball bearing is resting against the adjuster and what happens when you index these adjusters. And then a very fun part is that the cutaway shows inside of the clamper and what's actually happening when you pull your brake lever. So when you pull your brake lever, you're actuating the aptly named actuator arm, and that's rotating everything. So the actuator arm is connected to the actuator piston, which then touches the ball bearings on top of our pad piston. So I guess this is a side view of the piston assembly. There's 3 ball bearings that sit on these teardrop shaped ramps, and as we actuate the arm, we're rotating that top piston, and that rotational force is being applied to those 3 ball bearings, and that's being transferred onto this pad piston. Now this pad piston has these 3 grooves on the side, and these grooves rest against steel pins that are forced into this caliper body. Now because the pad piston is forced in place, when we actuate the arm, the rotational force of this actuator piston is being transferred through the ball bearings into the pad piston, which is pinned in place by those steel pins. So that's taking rotational force and changing it into linear force. And then the pad piston is now moving sideways without rotating, being pushed out the back of this caliper body and then into the pad, which then would hit a rotor if it were there. So that's what's happening inside of our clampers every time we use them. So now we'll take our clamper, take that detent kit out, and then take all those pieces out. So 2.5 hex takes out our little mini set screw that we're not going to drop and lose. And we'll set that aside. This side tends to be a little greasier, so the spring and ball bearing might be a little hard to get out. You can just kind of tap it on the table or use something that has a magnetic tip and take those pieces out, set those aside, get some grease off my hands and off this part. All right, now we can rotate or thread this adjuster off. As it unthreads, I would put a thumb on that actuator piston that's sticking out just to keep the piston assembly compressed and together. All right, the adjuster's threading off. Take that piece out like so. On this adjuster, we have 2 pieces that you might want to think about when taking apart a clamper because they could be cleaned and re-lubricated. There is a thrust bearing and a thrust washer that sit inside this adjuster. Thrust bearing, thrust washer, or roller bearing. These will get greasy just because the inside of this body, there's a whole bunch of grease packed in there. When we initially assemble a clamper, we get some tri-flow on those roller bearing threads. So if you're going to take things apart and kind of be re-greasing everything and polishing things up, when we reassemble these, we're going to also put some tri-flow on there, so that's something to be mindful of. All right, now let's take the piston assembly out. Sometimes it just kind of falls out, and other times you'll have to use something on the back end to kind of pop that pad piston out, like that. Okay. So now here's our piston assembly and a return spring. So we have a very greasy piston assembly. Here's that return spring that's going to give you that very snappy pullback if it's dialed in appropriately. So we can clean that off of the non-existent grit because this is an unused clamper, but You might get dirty, they might get greasy. Okay. So there are all the internals of a clamper, thrust bearing, a thrust washer, our piston assembly. Here's a clean piston so you can kind of really see what's going on. And then our adjuster and our return spring. And this one goes on the back side. So if you get to this stage and you're replacing the entire piston assembly, I would take some time, maybe alcohol and a paper towel, and kind of clean out everything that gets kind of built up in there. Be a good time to get old grease out and to repack with some new grease. This body is still pretty full of grease, being that this was a clamper I just took out of a box. But make sure that there is ample amount of grease at the bottom there, and then we'll be greasing everything again as we put them in layers. So the first thing to go in is going to be that return spring. So kind of take that and just stick it there at the bottom, like so. And then we're going to put the piston assembly back in. This piston assembly. So the pad piston has these grooves on the side like we were referring to before. Those need to line up with the 3 steel pins that are inside that body. There's only 3 orientations they can be in as they click in. What we're looking for is for the actuator piston, the top here. This is the portion that's going to be connected to the actuator arm. This is kind of oriented in this angle, kind of, I guess, angled towards this barrel adjuster. Because once we put the adjuster on, this actuator arm is going to go on top, and we need it to be oriented like this. There are a couple other positions that they could sit in, but this is the one that we're looking for. All right, once that's in, we can get the adjuster on. Whoops. Thrust bearing goes on first. Duh. So I'll get the bearing on. Excuse me, the washer. I'll get the bearing on. Dab a little bit of tri-flow on there for good measure. Then we can reapply this adjuster back onto the clamper. As you're threading this adjuster on, just be mindful of how far you're because right now we're compressing the whole piston assembly, and pretty soon the pad piston is going to start sticking through the back of the adjuster, excuse me, of the caliper body. So kind of just thread this adjuster on until you see that pad piston starting to peek out the back. We want to keep that inside the caliper right now to give us as much room as possible for the brake pads and then the rotor as we dial in a complete clamper. So this side's done. We'll get this piece in really quick too. The inboard adjuster, I'll just get a little bit of grease back on these threads, like so. Of course, using crystal white lightning. All right, get this adjuster back on this side. Same concept here, just thread this on until you see the adjuster start to poke through. So you want that nice and flush with that backing plate. So now we have 100% of the space for the pads and the rotor. All right, now detent kit time. We're going to take a ball bearing, a set spring, set screw. We're going to take all 3 of these pieces, and a set goes in each hole. So ball bearing in, a spring, and a set screw. 2.5 Allen. We'll thread that back in. Once that set screw is kind of flush with the body, I would stop tightening and then go to the adjuster and kind of see how it feels. I can feel the indexing now. It's just very light. I'd like it to be a little bit heavier, but if you thread this on way too much, it's just going to bind the ball bearing against those threads, and you're not going to get any kind of adjustment at all. But we are going to go slightly tighter. So clockwise, maybe a quarter turn, and then check that again. On this side, you can kind of hear the indexing as that ball bearing snaps on the ramps of the threads. Want a little bit tighter. All right, that's feeling pretty good. But you do have a little bit of adjustment here where if you want this set screw to be slightly on the tighter side, then you'll just really feel that indexing as you make adjustments. So if you're on trail and you have gloves on, maybe have this a little bit tighter and you can really feel that indexing as you dial in your pads. So we'll do the same thing on this side. Ball bearing, a little spring, and a set screw. Same concept. Once you get that flush or kind of inside the caliper body, then we're going to test. All right, same thing. I can feel the indexing. It's a bit, you'll feel way more resistance on this side because of that return spring that's inside. We're compressing that spring and that's pushing back on the adjuster, and so the thread contact between these two pieces is a little bit tighter. But this is still a little too loose. I want to feel that indexing a little bit more. So I will give it maybe, what is that, 1/4 of a turn, and then check again. All right, that's feeling pretty good. So once you have it indexed where you want it, back it out until the pad piston is just barely, maybe just keep it flush with that caliper body. All right, detent kits are set. Now we will get the actuator arm back on. So actuator arm goes back on top. Take that, I don't know, I call this a penny washer. Penny washer, there's kind of a nicer side that has more of a rounded look. So that goes up and then drop it on the table and then put it on again for good measure. And then the little button head screw. The hell? Okay, that threads on with a 3mm Allen. Who is Allen? You know, like Hex. Maybe that was his last name. Okay, get that on nice and tight, and then actually actuate the arm to make sure that everything feels good. It should spring back. Your adjusters should want to rotate, but only under pressure, and you want to feel that nice click, that indexing on both sides. Barrel adjuster should be there and dialed all the way in. And then we have, again, a fully assembled IS short pull clamper. Let's see. Final notes. The one thing that I can't express enough is the detent kits. I've dealt with many clampers being sent back in where these were used improperly and they're screwed in way too tight, and people have even taken like adjustable wrenches to these knobs on the adjuster to try to rotate this adjuster. But if this is all too tight, you've already mashed the threads on this piece, and then you're threading the mashed threads onto other threads inside the caliper body, and then everything binds up and I got to replace a bunch of parts. It's just a real hassle to get out. So if you're going to do any kind of maintenance, disassembly on a clamper, and you're going to be maybe switching these adjusters out or doing any kind of changes, just be mindful of how tight these set screws are. I just take them out all the way and set them aside so that you can really take pieces out without messing up any threads. And then once you have it all assembled, get it back on your bike and get your bike on a trail, get your butt on a seat and your hands on handlebars and bike a little bit, you know? Shouts out to my mom.
Yes.
Okay, that one was way better.